The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Leavenworth, Kansas, as Sarah Jane Whitmore arranged her handmade goods on the market table, her hands trembling slightly as she heard the familiar snickers beginning already. It was September of 1876, and the frontier town bustled with activity as ranchers, soldiers from the nearby fort, and townsfolk moved between the market stalls that lined the main thoroughfare. Sarah had been coming to this market every Saturday for 3 months now, hoping to sell enough of her baked goods, preserves, and needlework to help keep the small homestead she shared with her elderly aunt afloat. But every week brought the same humiliation. "Lord have mercy, look at the size of that woman," came a voice from somewhere behind her, followed by cruel laughter. Sarah's cheeks burned as she pretended not to hear, focusing instead on arranging the apple pies she had baked before dawn that morning. She was a large woman, there was no denying it, with curves that strained against even the most generously cut dresses. Her aunt had helped her sew this particular calico dress with extra fabric, but Sarah still felt exposed, vulnerable, as though her body was on display alongside her wares. "How much do you charge, miss?" "By the pound." Another voice called out, and this time the laughter was louder, more pointed. Sarah blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears gathering in her eyes fall. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more cruelty. A woman in a fine green silk dress paused at Sarah's table, picking up one of the embroidered handkerchiefs with delicate fingers. For a moment, Sarah's heart lifted with hope. Then the woman's companion, a thin, blonde woman with a pinched face, leaned in and whispered something that made them both laugh. The handkerchief was dropped back onto the table without a word, and they moved on. Sarah swallowed hard and straightened her shoulders. She had goods to sell, and dwelling on the cruelty of others would not put food on the table or pay the mortgage on the homestead. Her Aunt Martha depended on her, especially since the arthritis had gotten so bad that the older woman could barely work the spinning wheel anymore. Sarah had to be strong. The morning wore on with little success. A few people stopped to look at her goods, but most moved on quickly once they got a good look at her. Sarah knew what they were thinking. How could someone so clearly gluttonous, someone so lacking in self-control, possibly produce goods worth buying? Never mind that her pies were the flakiest in 3 counties, or that her needlework was so fine it could rival anything produced back east. Her appearance was all they saw. By noon, Sarah had sold exactly 2 jars of preserves and 1 loaf of bread, earning her a grand total of 35 cents. She needed at least $5 to make the week worthwhile, to justify the cost of the ingredients and the market stall fee. Despair began to creep in around the edges of her determination. "Well, if it is not the fat lady from the farm," sneered a familiar voice. Sarah looked up to see Margaret Thornton, the banker's daughter, standing before her table with 2 of her equally fashionable friends. Margaret was everything Sarah was not: petite, blonde, perfectly proportioned according to the fashion magazines that came on the train from St. Louis. She was also the meanest person Sarah had ever encountered. "Good afternoon, Miss Thornton," Sarah said quietly, keeping her voice level and polite. "Can I interest you in anything today?" "Interest me." "In food you have probably already sampled extensively." Margaret's voice carried across the market square, drawing attention from neighboring stalls. "I wonder that you have anything left to sell at all, given your obvious appetites." The friends giggled, and Sarah felt her face grow hot. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, but what could she say? Any protest would only provide more ammunition for their cruelty. "These pies look lovely," one of Margaret's friends said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Tell me, how many of these do you eat yourself each day?" Surely that is how you have achieved such an impressive figure." The laughter that followed was like knives. Sarah's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. She gripped the edge of her table until her knuckles turned white, praying for this moment to end, for the earth to open up and swallow her whole. "Ladies, I believe you are blocking the way." The voice was male, deep and rich, with a slight drawl that marked him as someone from further south, maybe Texas or Oklahoma territory. Sarah looked up to see a tall cowboy standing behind Margaret's group, his hat casting a shadow over his face. He wore dusty trail clothes, leather chaps over denim pants, and a red kerchief tied around his neck. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster well worn but cared for. Margaret turned, ready to deliver a cutting remark, but something in the cowboy's stance made her pause. He was not threatening exactly, but there was a quiet authority in the way he stood, a sense that this was not a man to be trifled with. "We were just leaving," Margaret said, lifting her chin. "There is nothing of interest here anyway." She swept away with her friends in tow, their skirts rustling with indignation. The cowboy watched them go, then stepped up to Sarah's table. When he removed his hat, Sarah got her first good look at him. He was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with sun-darkened skin and brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking blue-gray like storm clouds, and when they met Sarah's gaze, she saw no judgment in them, only curiosity and something that might have been kindness. "Madam," he said, nodding respectfully. "Philip Garrett Anderson, though most folks just call me Garrett." He had a strong jaw shadowed with a few days' worth of stubble, and when he smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkled in a way that suggested he did it often. "Sarah Jane Whitmore," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She was still shaken from Margaret's attack, and the unexpected kindness from this stranger had somehow made her defenses crumble even more than the cruelty had. "Miss Whitmore," Garrett said, his gaze sweeping over her table. "These your goods?" "Yes, sir." "I have pies, preserves, fresh bread, and some needlework." She gestured to the items with a trembling hand, trying to compose herself. Garrett picked up one of the pies, examining it with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Apple?" "Yes, sir." "Made with apples from our own trees, and cinnamon I traded for at the general store. The crust is made with real butter and lard, folded 7 times to make it flaky." He nodded thoughtfully, then set the pie down and picked up a jar of preserves. "Strawberry." "Strawberry rhubarb," Sarah corrected softly. "It is a bit tart but good on biscuits or toast." Garrett examined several more items, asking questions about each one. What kind of flour did she use? Where did she get her thread? How long did it take to make the needlework? Sarah answered each question, gradually relaxing as she realized his interest was sincere. He was not mocking her or looking for ammunition to use against her. He genuinely wanted to know about her products. Finally, after examining nearly everything on her table, Garrett straightened and looked at her directly. "How much for everything?" Sarah blinked, certain she had misheard. "I am sorry. Everything on this table, how much would you want for all of it? I do not understand." "Do you mean a particular type of item, or—" "I mean all of it," Garrett interrupted gently. "Every pie, every jar of preserves, every loaf of bread, and all the needlework." "How much?" Sarah's mind raced, trying to calculate. She had brought more goods than usual today, hoping against hope for good sales. There were 6 pies, 12 jars of preserves, 8 loaves of bread, and at least 15 pieces of needlework, ranging from simple handkerchiefs to an elaborately embroidered tablecloth that had taken her 3 weeks to complete. That would be. She fumbled with the figures, her hands shaking so badly she could barely count on her fingers. "Perhaps $30. 32. Garrett pulled out a leather wallet and counted out bills. 35 sound fair. Sir, I could not possibly. You are worth every penny, Miss Whitmore, he said firmly, placing the bills on her table. And I will be needing help getting all this back to my wagon. Would you mind assisting? Sarah stared at the money, more than she had made in the previous 2 months combined. Her throat tightened with emotion, and she had to blink rapidly to clear her vision. Of course, I would be happy to help. They worked together to pack everything into crates, Garrett handling the heavier items while Sarah carefully wrapped the more delicate pieces in cloth. As they worked, Sarah became acutely aware of the stares they were receiving from other market-goers. She could almost hear the whispers, the speculation about why a handsome cowboy would be spending time with someone like her. Garrett's wagon was parked at the end of the market street, a sturdy vehicle hitched to 2 strong horses. He loaded the crates carefully, making sure nothing would shift during the journey. When everything was secured, he turned back to Sarah, who stood awkwardly beside the wagon, unsure what to say or do. Miss Whitmore, Garrett said, his voice gentle, I could not help but overhear some of what those women said to you earlier. Sarah's stomach dropped. She had hoped he had not heard that he had arrived after the worst of it. I apologize that you had to witness that, she said, her voice tight with embarrassment. You are apologizing, Garrett's eyebrows rose. You were not the one behaving shamefully. They ought to be ashamed, speaking to another human being that way. They were just. Sarah trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence, just being honest, just saying what everyone else was thinking. She looked down at her hands, twisted together in front of her apron. Garrett stepped closer, and Sarah fought the urge to back away. He was so tall, so solid, and she was intensely aware of how she must look beside him. But when she finally gathered the courage to glance up at his face, what she saw there took her breath away. His expression was earnest, almost fierce, with no trace of pity or mockery. Miss Whitmore, I want you to hear this, really hear it, he said. You are perfect. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Sarah could not immediately process them. What? You are perfect, Garrett repeated. Those women, they are small and mean-spirited, and they judge worth by the shallowest of measures. But I have been traveling this country for years now, and I have learned that real worth has nothing to do with appearances. You work hard, you create beautiful things, and you conduct yourself with grace even when faced with cruelty. That makes you perfect in my book. Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. No one had ever spoken to her this way, with such conviction and kindness. You do not even know me, she whispered. Then let me remedy that, Garrett said, a small smile playing at his lips. Miss Whitmore, would you do me the honor of having dinner with me this evening? There is a decent restaurant in town, and I would very much like to continue our conversation. Every instinct Sarah possessed screamed at her to refuse. This had to be some kind of joke, a setup for further humiliation. Men like Garrett Anderson did not court women like her. It simply did not happen. And yet, as she looked into his eyes, she saw nothing but sincerity. I would like that, she heard herself say, her voice trembling. But I would need to let my aunt know. She will worry if I am late returning home. Of course, Garrett said immediately. Where is your homestead? I would be happy to drive you there first, let you speak with your aunt, and then bring you back to town. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. It is about 3 miles west of town on the old trading road. The property has a white fence in front, though it is looking rather shabby these days. Then let us go, Garrett said, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. The ride out to the homestead passed in a blur. Garrett kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling Sarah about his travels. He had been working as a ranch hand and occasionally as a scout, since he was 18 years old, moving from place to place as work demanded. He had just finished a long cattle drive from Texas and was planning to winter in Kansas, possibly finding work at one of the larger ranches in the area. Sarah found herself relaxing as they talked, drawn in by his easy manner and genuine interest. He asked her about her life, and she found herself telling him about growing up on the homestead, about her parents' deaths from fever 5 years earlier, about her Aunt Martha who had moved in to help but whose health was now failing. "It has been difficult," Sarah admitted, "but we manage. The land is good and we have chickens and a milk cow. I sell what I can at the market and we grow most of our own food. It is not an easy life, but it is ours." When they reached the homestead, Aunt Martha was in the yard, scattering feed for the chickens. She looked up in surprise as the wagon approached, her weathered face creasing with concern when she saw Sarah was not alone. "Aunt Martha," Sarah called out as Garrett helped her down from the wagon. "This is Mr. Philip Anderson. He purchased everything I had at the market today." Martha's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Everything, everything," Sarah confirmed, a smile breaking across her face. "And he has invited me to dinner in town this evening. Would that be acceptable?" Martha looked Garrett up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who had lived long enough to recognize character when she saw it. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "I suppose that would be fine. But Sarah, you will want to change into a fresh dress." "I will only be a moment," Sarah promised, hurrying toward the small house. Behind her, she heard Aunt Martha's voice, sharp despite her age. "Mr. Anderson, I am sure you are a fine young man, but I need to know your intentions toward my niece." Sarah paused just inside the door, her heart pounding as she strained to hear Garrett's response. "Madam, my intentions are entirely honorable," Garrett said clearly. "I met your niece today at the market, and I was impressed by her craftsmanship and her character. I would like the opportunity to know her better, with your blessing." "She is a good girl," Martha said, her voice softer now. "She has been hurt before by people who could not see past appearances. I will not stand by and watch it happen again." "I understand, madam. And I give you my word, I have no intention of hurting her." Sarah did not wait to hear more. She rushed to her small bedroom and quickly changed into her best dress, a deep blue cotton that her mother had made years ago. It was somewhat faded now, but it still fit reasonably well, and the color brought out the green in her hazel eyes. She brushed out her long brown hair and pinned it up as neatly as she could manage, allowing a few curls to frame her round face. When she emerged, Aunt Martha was showing Garrett the chicken coop, still talking in that assessing way of hers. But when Martha saw Sarah in the doorway, she smiled. "You look lovely, dear." Garrett turned, and the expression on his face made Sarah's breath catch. He looked at her as though she were beautiful, truly beautiful, and for a moment, she almost believed it herself. The ride back to town was quieter than the journey out, but it was a comfortable silence. Sarah found herself intensely aware of Garrett's presence beside her, the warmth of his arm just inches from hers, the occasional brush of his shoulder when the wagon hit a rut in the road. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The restaurant Garrett had chosen was called the Golden Ox, a respectable establishment on the main street. Sarah had never eaten there before. It was far too expensive for her budget, but she had heard it served good food. As they entered, Sarah noticed heads turning, recognized the familiar looks of surprise and speculation. A woman of her size dining with a man like Garrett was clearly unusual enough to warrant attention. But Garrett seemed oblivious to the stares. He held her chair for her, a gesture that made her feel like a lady from one of those novels Aunt Martha liked to read. When the waiter arrived, Garrett ordered a steak dinner for himself and encouraged Sarah to order whatever she liked. Sarah hesitated, acutely aware that every bite she took would be scrutinized. She could already imagine the whispers, the knowing looks. But Garrett was watching her with such open encouragement that she found herself ordering the roasted chicken with vegetables and a side of fresh bread. As they waited for their food, Garrett leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Tell me about your needlework, Miss Whitmore." "That tablecloth I purchased, the one with the flowers, that was extraordinary work." Sarah felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you. That pattern was based on something my mother taught me, but I added my own variations. The roses are traditional, but the wild prairie flowers in the border, those are from my own design." "You have an artist's eye," Garrett said. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" "Since I was a girl. My mother believed every woman should know how to make a home beautiful, even if that home was a simple cabin on the prairie. She taught me needlework, cooking, all the domestic arts. She said that creating beauty in the world was a form of prayer." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Sarah said softly. "I miss her every day, both my parents, really. My father was a farmer, not a wealthy man, but a good one. He worked hard and he loved his family. When the fever came through, it took them both within a week of each other." "I am sorry for your loss," Garrett said, and the sincerity in his voice made Sarah's eyes prickle with tears. "Thank you. It was 5 years ago now, but some days it feels like yesterday." She paused as the waiter brought their food, grateful for the momentary distraction. When they were alone again, she asked, "What about your family, Mr. Anderson? Do they live nearby? Call me Garrett, please. And no, my family is back in Oklahoma Territory. My father runs a small ranch there with my 2 younger brothers. I am the oldest, and I suppose I got the wandering spirit. I love the land and the work, but I could never quite settle in one place. At least I could not until recently." "What changed recently?" Sarah asked, then immediately wished she had not. It was too forward, too personal a question. But Garrett did not seem to mind. He cut a piece of his steak, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "I suppose I started to realize that moving from place to place, never putting down roots, it starts to feel hollow after a while. I am 27 years old, and I have nothing to show for all those years of work except some money in the bank and a lot of stories. I started thinking maybe it was time to find a place to call home. Really call home, not just a bunkhouse I am staying in until the next job comes along." "Is that why you are planning to stay in Kansas for the winter?" Sarah asked. "Partly. But I will admit after today, I am thinking I might want to stay longer than just the winter." The implication in his words made Sarah's heart race. She took a bite of her chicken, buying herself time to think. This was all happening so fast. She had met this man only a few hours ago, and yet here they were, having dinner together, talking as though they had known each other for years. It should have felt strange, wrong somehow, but instead it felt natural, as though this was exactly where she was supposed to be. They talked through the entire meal, conversation flowing easily from one topic to another. Garrett told her about the cattle drives he had been on, the vast herds moving across open prairie, the challenges of keeping thousands of animals moving in the right direction. He described nights spent under stars so thick they looked like scattered diamonds, and mornings when the sun rose over the plains in a blaze of crimson and gold. Sarah told him about life on the homestead, about the satisfaction of watching things grow from seeds to harvest, about the chickens who each had their own distinct personalities, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with her own hands. She found herself laughing as she described some of the mishaps she had experienced learning to cook. like the time she had accidentally used salt instead of sugar in a pie, and her father had gamely eaten a whole slice anyway, insisting it was delicious. When the meal was finished and the plates cleared away, Garrett ordered coffee for them both. As they sipped the hot, strong brew, he reached across the table and took her hand. Sarah's first instinct was to pull away, to hide her plump fingers, but something in his steady gaze made her still. "Sarah," he said, using her given name for the first time. "I want to be honest with you. I know we have only just met, but I feel a connection with you that I have never felt with anyone else. You are kind, talented, and strong. The way you handled yourself at that market, facing cruelty with grace, that told me everything I need to know about your character." "Garrett, Sarah began, but he gently squeezed her hand, asking without words for her to let him finish. "I know this is sudden, and I do not want to presume anything, but I would very much like to court you properly if you will allow it. I want to get to know you better, to spend time with you, to see where this connection might lead." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to throw caution to the wind and embrace this unexpected chance at happiness. But another part, the part that had been hurt and mocked too many times, whispered warnings. This was too good to be true. Men like Garrett did not fall for women like her. There had to be some catch, some hidden cruelty waiting to reveal itself. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why me? You could have your pick of women, proper beautiful women like Margaret Thornton. Why would you want to court me?" Garrett's expression grew serious. He did not let go of her hand, but his thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, a gesture that was somehow more intimate than any kiss could have been. "Sarah, when I look at you, I do not see what those shallow people at the market see. I see a woman who wakes before dawn to bake pies that are works of art. I see someone who cares for her elderly aunt with devotion, who creates beauty even in difficult circumstances, who faces cruelty with dignity. I see your smile, which lights up your whole face, and your eyes, which are full of intelligence and kindness. I see you, the real you, and what I see is someone I very much want to know better." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek, and she made no move to wipe it away. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I am afraid this is some kind of dream, and I will wake up and discover it was all my imagination." "It is not a dream," Garrett assured her. "I am real, I am here, and I am asking for a chance. That is all. Just a chance to prove that what I am saying is true." Sarah took a shaky breath, then nodded. "Yes, yes, I would like that." The smile that broke across Garrett's face was like sunshine after a storm. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender that Sarah felt her heart might burst. They talked for another hour over coffee, making plans for Garrett to visit the homestead in a few days. He explained that he needed to find work and lodging first, but he promised to call on her as soon as he was settled. When he finally drove her home as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and pink, Sarah felt as though she was floating. Aunt Martha was waiting on the porch, and one look at Sarah's face told her everything she needed to know. After Garrett had said his goodbyes and driven away, promising to return soon, Martha pulled Sarah into a tight embrace. "He seems like a good man," Martha said quietly. "He does he not?" Sarah replied, hardly daring to believe it herself. "Aunt Martha, he said I was perfect, perfect." "Of course you are, child. I have been telling you that for years. I am just glad you finally met someone who can see it." The next few days passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Sarah threw herself into her work, baking and sewing with renewed energy. She had Garrett's money to invest in more supplies, which meant she could make even more goods for the next market day. But more than that, she had hope, a feeling she had not experienced in years. Garrett appeared at the homestead on Wednesday afternoon, just as he had promised. He came bearing gifts: a bag of sugar from the general store, expensive enough that Sarah and Martha usually had to make do without, and a bundle of colorful thread for Sarah's needlework. He also brought news that he had secured a job as the foreman at the Riverside Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the area, and had rented a small house in town. "It is not much," he admitted as they sat on the porch, Martha discreetly occupying herself with mending inside the house. "Just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it is clean and it is mine. Well, rented anyway." "It sounds wonderful," Sarah said, meaning it. The idea of having a space that was truly one's own, not just a room in a family home, seemed like luxury to her. Over the following weeks, Garrett became a regular visitor to the homestead. He came several times a week, always bringing something: a newspaper from town, fresh vegetables from the ranch, once even a new laying hen to add to Sarah's flock. He helped with repairs around the property, fixing the sagging fence that Sarah had mentioned and patching a leak in the barn roof that had been bothering her for months. More importantly, he spent hours just talking with Sarah, getting to know her in all the ways that mattered. They discussed books they had read, sharing favorite passages and arguing good-naturedly about plots and characters. They talked about their dreams and fears, their hopes for the future. Garrett shared stories of his childhood in Oklahoma Territory, of learning to ride before he could walk properly, of the fierce pride his father took in their small ranch. Sarah opened up about her own past, about the loneliness that had followed her parents' deaths, about the struggle to keep the homestead running when everything seemed to be falling apart. She told him about the isolation she had felt, how her size had made her a target for cruelty since childhood, how she had learned to make herself small in every way except the physical, trying to avoid notice and the inevitable mockery that came with it. Garrett listened to all of it with an attention that made Sarah feel truly heard for the first time in her life. He did not try to minimize her experiences or offer empty platitudes. He simply listened, and when she finished, he told her that anyone who could not see her worth was a fool. On a crisp October afternoon, Garrett took Sarah on a picnic to a spot he had discovered near the river. It was a beautiful location, with cottonwood trees providing shade and the water burbling peacefully over smooth stones. Garrett had packed a basket with bread, cheese, cold chicken, and apples, and they spread a blanket on the grass. As they ate, Garrett seemed nervous, more fidgety than Sarah had ever seen him. He kept starting to say something and then stopping, until finally Sarah laughed and put a hand on his arm. "Garrett, what is wrong? You are making me anxious with all this hemming and hawing." He took a deep breath, then met her eyes. "Sarah, I want to tell you something, but I am afraid of how you might react." Sarah's stomach dropped. This was it, the moment when the truth would come out, when whatever game he had been playing would be revealed. "Go ahead," she said, steeling herself for the blow. "I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, so different from what Sarah had expected that she could not immediately process them. "What?" "I am falling in love with you," Garrett repeated, his voice stronger now. "I think I started falling for you that first day at the market when I saw you standing there with your head held high despite everything those terrible people were saying. And every day since then, every conversation we have had, every moment we have spent together, I have fallen harder. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, Sarah Jane Whitmore, and I am completely, utterly in love with you." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were tears of joy. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I am. I love the way you look at me like I am beautiful. I love the way you listen when I talk, like what I have to say actually matters. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you make me laugh. I love you, Garrett." Garrett cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "May I kiss you?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak, and Garrett leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a kiss full of promise and tender affection. Sarah had been kissed before, fumbling encounters with boys who had wanted something from her but felt nothing for her. This was nothing like those experiences. This was a kiss that spoke of respect and genuine feeling, and when they finally pulled apart, Sarah felt transformed. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the river, talking and laughing and stealing occasional kisses. As the sun began to set and they packed up to head home, Sarah felt a contentment she had never experienced before. She was happy, truly happy, perhaps for the first time in her adult life. The weeks that followed were a golden time. Garrett continued to court Sarah with a devotion that made her Aunt Martha smile knowingly. He took her to church socials and town events, always treating her with respect and making it clear to everyone they met that she was his chosen woman. At first, Sarah was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them, but Garrett's confidence in their relationship eventually gave her confidence too. She began to hold her head higher, to meet people's curious gazes with calm assurance. Not everyone was accepting of their relationship. Margaret Thornton made a point of loudly speculating about Garrett's motives whenever Sarah was in earshot, suggesting that he must be after Sarah's land or money. Never mind that Sarah had little of either. Some of the other townspeople were merely puzzled, unable to understand what a man like Garrett saw in a woman like Sarah. But there were also people who were kind. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house made a point of complimenting Sarah on her new happiness. The Reverend's wife invited both Sarah and Garrett to Sunday dinner, treating them as a legitimate courting couple. And slowly, Sarah began to realize that the cruel people's opinions mattered less than she had always thought they did. What mattered was how Garrett looked at her, how he made her feel, how they were together. In November, Garrett asked Aunt Martha's permission to marry Sarah. Martha gave her blessing readily, though she made Garrett promise that Sarah would not be moving far away. "She is all the family I have," Martha said, her voice quavering slightly. "I could not bear to lose her entirely." "You will not lose her, madam," Garrett assured her. "We have been discussing it, and we were hoping you might be willing to sell us the homestead. Sarah loves this land, and so do I. We would like to stay here, build our life here. You would always have a home with us for as long as you live." Martha's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Garrett into a fierce hug. "You are a good man, Philip Anderson. You take care of my girl." "I will, madam, I swear it." Garrett proposed to Sarah that evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. He had no ring yet, he explained, but he wanted her to know his intentions right away. Sarah said yes before he had even finished asking, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him with all the joy and love in her heart. They were married in December of 1876, in a simple ceremony at the church in Leavenworth. Sarah wore a dress she had sewn herself, made from cream-colored fabric that Garrett had bought for her in Kansas City. She had embroidered the bodice with delicate flowers, and Aunt Martha wove real winter berries into her hair. She felt beautiful walking down the aisle toward Garrett, who looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. The wedding was small, attended mostly by Garrett's friends from the ranch, and a few of Sarah's customers who had become friendly over the months. Margaret Thornton was not invited, and Sarah did not miss her presence at all. What mattered was standing before the Reverend with Garrett's hands holding hers, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. The winter that followed was the happiest time of Sarah's life. Garrett moved into the homestead, and they turned one of the outbuildings into a larger workshop for Sarah's crafts. Garrett had saved nearly every penny he had earned over the years, and he invested it in improvements to the property. More chickens, a couple of pigs, seeds for a larger garden in the spring. He continued working as foreman at Riverside Ranch, but he was always home by evening, and they fell into a comfortable rhythm of domesticity. Aunt Martha's health, which had been declining for years, seemed to stabilize with the reduced worry and increased help around the homestead. She delighted in Garrett's presence, often telling Sarah how lucky she was to have found such a good man. "I was worried about what would happen to you after I was gone," Martha confided one evening as they worked together on mending. "But now I know you will be taken care of. Garrett loves you deeply. Anyone can see that." "I love him too, Aunt Martha, so very much." Spring arrived with its usual flurry of activity. Garrett and Sarah planted a large garden, working side by side in the rich Kansas soil. Sarah's market business continued to grow, especially as word spread about the quality of her goods. She noticed that the mockery had diminished, replaced by a grudging respect. It was harder to ridicule someone when they were clearly thriving. In April, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Garrett one evening after supper, hardly able to contain her excitement. Garrett's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to have a baby," he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. "Sarah, we are going to be parents." The pregnancy was not easy. Sarah struggled with sickness in the early months, and as she grew larger, the physical challenges increased. But Garrett was devoted in his care of her, taking on more of the household tasks and fussing over her like a mother hen. Aunt Martha was equally attentive, making sure Sarah rested and ate properly. In December of 1877, exactly 1 year after their wedding, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Peter, after Garrett's father, and from the moment he was placed in Sarah's arms, she knew she had never loved anything more. Garrett was equally smitten, spending hours just watching the baby sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. Aunt Martha declared that Peter was the most beautiful baby she had ever seen, and she became his devoted guardian. On the rare occasions when both Sarah and Garrett needed to be away from the homestead, Martha watched over the boy with fierce protectiveness. Life settled into a new rhythm with the baby. Sarah continued her crafts when she could, though her time was now divided between her business and caring for Peter. Garrett proved to be a natural father, patient and loving, never complaining about the sleepless nights or the disruptions to their routine. When Peter was 6 months old, the family received unexpected news. Garrett's father had died suddenly, and his mother was struggling to keep the Oklahoma Territory ranch running with only Garrett's brothers, who were still quite young. Garrett needed to go home to help settle affairs and ensure his mother was cared for. "Come with me," he urged Sarah. "All of you. We could move to Oklahoma, take over the family ranch." But Sarah looked around at the homestead they had built together, at Aunt Martha, who was now too frail to travel, and she knew they could not leave. "This is our home, Garrett. Your family needs you, and you should go to them. But we will be here waiting for you when you return." It was one of the hardest decisions they had ever made, but Garrett knew Sarah was right. He left in June, promising to return as soon as possible. In his absence, Sarah ran the homestead with Aunt Martha's help, handling everything from the garden to the market sales to caring for Peter. It was exhausting work, but she discovered a strength in herself that she had not known existed: Garrett was gone for 3 months. In that time, he helped his mother sell the Oklahoma ranch, getting her a good price and ensuring she had enough money to live comfortably. He helped his younger brothers, ages 19 and 21, find positions on a larger ranch where they could learn and grow. And when everything was settled, he came home to Kansas, bringing his mother with him. Garrett Anderson was a small woman with Garrett's same blue-gray eyes and a quiet strength that reminded Sarah of Aunt Martha. The two older women took to each other immediately, and Garrett settled into the homestead as though she had always been there. Having two grandmothers doting on Peter was a blessing, especially as Sarah's workload continued to grow. The years that followed were good ones. The homestead prospered under Garrett and Sarah's care. They added more land, purchasing the adjacent property when it came up for sale. Garrett's position at Riverside Ranch was secure, and Sarah's crafts business had grown to the point where she was receiving orders from as far away as St. Louis. In 1879, Sarah gave birth to a daughter whom they named Susan after Sarah's mother. 2 years later, another boy arrived whom they called Matthew. The house was full of noise and laughter, and though there were challenges, there was also abundant joy. Aunt Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1881, at the age of 74. It was a loss that hit Sarah hard, but she took comfort in the knowledge that Martha had spent her final years surrounded by love and family. They buried her in the small cemetery outside of town, next to Sarah's parents. Garrett proved to be a capable and loving presence in the household, helping with the children and the household tasks. She and Sarah developed a close relationship, more like sisters than mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Garrett often told Sarah that she was exactly the daughter she had always hoped to have, and Sarah cherished those words. As the children grew, Sarah made sure they understood the value of kindness and the importance of looking beyond appearances. She told them stories of how she and their father had met, about the cruelty she had faced, and the way Garrett had seen past society's shallow judgments to recognize her true worth. "Your father saved me," she would tell them. "Not because I needed rescuing, but because he gave me the courage to see myself as I truly was, strong, capable, and worthy of love." Peter grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and learning. Susan inherited her mother's talent for needlework and her father's easy charm. Matthew was adventurous and bold, always getting into scrapes but always with a smile on his face. Garrett and Sarah raised them with love and firm guidance, teaching them to work hard and treat others with respect. In 1885, Garrett surprised Sarah by using his savings to build an addition onto their house. The new wing included a proper workshop for Sarah's crafts, with large windows for natural light and shelves for all her supplies. It also included a small storefront where she could sell her goods directly, rather than having to haul everything to the market in Leavenworth. "You have worked so hard for so many years," Garrett told her when he revealed the completed space. "You deserve a place that is entirely yours, where you can create without worrying about where to put everything." Sarah was so moved she could hardly speak. She threw her arms around Garrett and held him tight, overwhelmed by gratitude for this man who had seen her worth from the very beginning and had never stopped showing her how much he valued her. The store was a success almost immediately. People began making special trips out to the homestead to purchase Sarah's goods, drawn by the quality of her work and the growing reputation she had built. She hired 2 local girls to help with the increased workload, teaching them the techniques her mother had taught her years ago. Margaret Thornton, who had married a wealthy merchant from Kansas City and rarely returned to Leavenworth, happened to stop by the store during one of her visits home. Sarah was helping a customer when Margaret walked in, her eyes widening with surprise when she recognized Sarah. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret said, then corrected herself. "Mrs. Anderson, I mean." "Miss Thornton," Sarah replied calmly, finishing her transaction before turning her full attention to her former tormentor. "Or should I say, Mrs. Bradford, I heard you married. How can I help you today?" Margaret looked around the store, taking in the displays of beautifully crafted goods, the steady stream of customers, the obvious prosperity. "I had heard you were doing well," she said slowly. "I wanted to see for myself." "And what do you think?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost regretful. "I think I was very cruel to you years ago. I think I was shallow and mean-spirited, and I judged you unfairly. I am sorry for that, Mrs. Anderson, truly sorry." Sarah studied Margaret's face, searching for signs of insincerity, but all she saw was genuine remorse. "Thank you for saying that," Sarah said finally. "It takes courage to admit when we have been wrong." "You have built a beautiful life," Margaret said, glancing around the store again. "A beautiful business, a beautiful family. I can see that through the window, your children playing in the yard. You have everything anyone could want." "I do," Sarah agreed. "I am very blessed." After Margaret left, Sarah stood in her store and looked around, really looked at what she had built. She thought about that day at the market nearly a decade earlier, when she had been so close to giving up, when the cruelty had seemed overwhelming and unending. She thought about Garrett approaching her table, buying everything she had, and saying those 3 words that had changed her life. "You are perfect." He had been right, she realized. Not perfect in the sense of being without flaw, but perfect in the sense of being exactly who she was meant to be. Her body, which she had spent so many years hating, had given her 3 beautiful children. Her hands, which had created goods to sell out of desperate necessity, had built a thriving business. Her heart, which had been so battered and bruised, had opened to love and been rewarded with more happiness than she had ever imagined possible. Garrett came in from the fields as the sun was setting, dirty and tired from a long day of work. The children ran to greet him, and he scooped up Susan and Matthew, one in each arm, while Peter walked alongside them talking about something he had read. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing supper, and the house smelled of fresh bread and roasting chicken. Sarah watched her husband with their children, and her heart swelled with love. He had kept every promise he had made to her. He had loved her completely, had built a life with her, had given her children and happiness, and a sense of belonging she had never thought possible. That night, after the children were in bed and Eleanor had retired to her room, Sarah and Garrett sat together on the porch as they often did. Garrett had his arm around her shoulders, and Sarah leaned into his warmth, perfectly content. "You remember the day we met?" Sarah asked softly. "Every detail," Garrett replied. "You were standing at your market table, arranging pies, and there were these terrible people saying awful things. You looked so strong, so determined not to let them see how much they were hurting you. I knew right then that you were someone special." "You changed my life that day," Sarah said. "You gave me hope when I had none left. You saw me when I felt invisible. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable." Garrett tightened his arm around her. "Sarah, you have that backwards. You changed my life. Before I met you, I was just drifting, moving from place to place with no real purpose. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. I am the one who should be grateful." "Then we are both grateful," Sarah said, smiling up at him. "We are both blessed." "That we are," Garrett agreed, and he bent to kiss her, a kiss that still held all the tenderness and passion of their early days together. In 1890, their 4th child was born, another girl whom they named Martha after Sarah's beloved aunt. The house was full to bursting with children and love and laughter. Peter was now a young teenager, already helping significantly with the ranch work. Susan had become an accomplished needleworker in her own right and was helping more in Sarah's store. Matthew was still finding his way, but he had a good heart and a willing spirit. Garrett had been promoted to co-owner of Riverside Ranch, the previous owner having decided to retire and recognizing that the ranch's success was largely due to Garrett's management. The position came with a generous salary and a share of the profits, which meant the family was more financially secure than they had ever been. But for all their success and prosperity, what Sarah treasured most were the quiet moments. Garrett reading to the children before bed, their voices creating a gentle murmur through the house. Working side by side in the garden with Garrett, their hands dirty and their hearts content. Watching her children play in the yard that she and Garrett had built together through years of hard work and devotion. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Sarah with a gift. It was a portrait, commissioned from a traveling artist who had passed through Leavenworth several months earlier. The painting showed Sarah as she was now, a woman in her mid-30s with laugh lines around her eyes and a gentle smile on her face. She was posed at her work table, surrounded by her crafts, and the artist had captured something in her expression that Sarah had never seen in herself before: confidence, contentment, beauty. "This is how I see you," Garrett told her as she stared at the portrait with tears in her eyes. "This is how you have always looked to me. Beautiful, capable, perfect." Sarah kissed him then, a long, deep kiss that spoke of 15 years of love and commitment and shared dreams. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered against his lips, "Thank you for seeing me, Garrett. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you for saying yes," Garrett replied. "Thank you for taking a chance on a wandering cowboy who fell in love with you at first sight." "At first sight?" Sarah asked, surprised. "You never told me that." "I did not want to scare you off," Garrett admitted with a grin. "But it is true. The moment I saw you standing at that market table, holding your head high despite everything, I knew. I knew you were the woman I had been waiting for my whole life. Every moment since then has only confirmed what I knew in that first instant, that you are perfect, Sarah Jane Anderson. Perfect for me in every way." As the years continued to pass, the Anderson family remained at the heart of the Leavenworth community. Sarah's store became a landmark, known throughout Kansas for the quality of its goods. People came from miles around to purchase her crafts, and she trained several young women in her techniques, ensuring that the skills her mother had taught her would be passed on to future generations. Garrett's success at Riverside Ranch continued, and eventually he became the full owner when his partner retired completely. He ran it with fairness and integrity, earning the respect of everyone who worked for him. People who remembered the young cowboy who had wandered into town years ago could hardly believe the man he had become. A successful rancher, a devoted husband and father, a pillar of the community. Their children grew and thrived. Peter went to university in Kansas City, studying agriculture with the intention of returning to help run the family ranch. Susan married a kind young man from a neighboring ranch, a wedding that filled Sarah with joy and perhaps a touch of bittersweet emotion as she watched her eldest daughter embark on her own love story. Matthew and Martha were still at home, growing up with the confidence that came from being raised by parents who loved them unconditionally. Alina lived to see all her grandchildren grown, passing away peacefully at the age of 78. She had spent her final years surrounded by the family she loved, and her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched with her quiet kindness. In 1895, on a warm spring day much like the day they had first met, Sarah and Garrett stood in the yard of their homestead and looked out over everything they had built. The house had grown over the years, expanded to accommodate their large family. The store was thriving with Sarah's goods in high demand. The fields were green with growing crops and the livestock were healthy and numerous. "We did well, did we not?" Garrett said, his arm around Sarah's waist. "We did," Sarah agreed, leaning into him. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "Do you ever think about that day at the market?" Garrett asked. "The day we met." "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "I think about how close I came to giving up, to letting the cruelty of others define me. I think about how you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not even known how to pray. I think about how one moment of kindness, one person willing to see past appearances to the truth beneath, changed everything." "You would have been fine without me," Garrett said. "You are the strongest person I know, Sarah. You would have found your way." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But I am so grateful I did not have to find it alone. I am grateful for every day we have had together, for our children, for this life we have built. I am grateful that you saw me when I felt invisible, that you loved me when I thought I was unlovable, that you showed me I was perfect just as I am." "You are perfect," Garrett said, turning her to face him. His hair was gray now at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes, but when he looked at her, Sarah saw the same love and devotion that had been there from the very beginning. "You always have been, and you always will be. My perfect Sarah." He kissed her then, a kiss that held nearly 20 years of shared history, of joys and sorrows, of challenges overcome and dreams fulfilled. And as the sun set over their Kansas homestead, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah Jane Anderson knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. Years later, when her grandchildren would ask her to tell them the story of how she and their grandfather fell in love, Sarah would always start the same way. "It was a difficult day at the market, and I was ready to give up hope. But then a cowboy appeared and bought everything I had to sell. And when I asked him why, when I told him all the reasons I did not deserve such kindness, he looked me right in the eyes and said 3 words that changed my life forever." "What did he say, Grandma?" the children would ask, even though they had heard the story 100 times before. And Sarah would smile, her eyes finding Garrett across the room, and she would say, "He told me I was perfect, and for the first time in my life I believed it." The Anderson family continued to grow and prosper in Leavenworth, Kansas, for generations to come. But the story of how it all began, with a plus-sized woman facing cruelty at a market and a kind cowboy who saw her true worth, became a family legend. It was a story about looking past appearances, about the transformative power of love and acceptance, about building a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. It was a story about how one moment of compassion could change everything, how one person willing to see the truth could make all the difference. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple. A story of 2 people who found each other against all odds and built a beautiful life together, proving that real love sees the heart, not the exterior, and that when you find someone who truly sees you, who loves you exactly as you are, that is when you know you have found something perfect. And they lived that perfect life together, Sarah and Garrett Anderson, until the end of their days. They grew old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by the thriving business they had built and the land they had tended with love and care. They faced challenges, as all couples do, but they faced them together, their bond only growing stronger with each passing year. When Garrett passed away in 1910 at the age of 60, Sarah mourned him deeply but without regret. They had had 44 years together, years filled with more love and happiness than most people experienced in a lifetime. She lived another 8 years after his death, spending her time with her family and her crafts, always carrying Garrett's memory in her heart. On her own deathbed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Sarah's last words were about the day she had met Garrett. "He told me I was perfect," she whispered, a smile on her face. "And he spent every day for the rest of his life proving it. I was so lucky, so very, very lucky." The legacy of Sarah and Garrett Anderson lived on long after they were gone. Their descendants continued to run the ranch and the store, keeping alive the values of hard work, compassion, and acceptance that Sarah and Garrett had instilled in them. The story of their meeting, of how a cowboy saw past society's cruel judgments to recognize a woman's true worth, was passed down through the generations, inspiring countless others to look beyond appearances and recognize the beauty in every person. And in Leavenworth, Kansas, where it all began, there was a plaque placed in the market square, commemorating the spot where Sarah Jane Whitmore had once stood with her handmade goods, where she had faced ridicule and cruelty, and where Philip Garrett Anderson had seen her, really seen her, and changed both their lives forever with 3 simple words: "You are perfect."